today we're going to be talking about the lifetime allowance and sort of the effects, and the changes in 2024. But before we get started, Jake, can you explain to us, the history of the LTA and who does it affect?
Yeah, so the lifetime allowance it came into play in 2006 and effectively taxed people on the amount of pension that was above the lifetime allowance in UK registered pension schemes. So over the years, there's been a lot of changes to lifetime allowance and different ways that you could protect yourself. So you had things like protection that could actually protect you above the amount that the lifetime allowance was potentially reduced to, because the highest it ever got to was 1.8 million. It went down to 1.5, down to 1.25, down to 1 million, and then it increased by inflation. But then since 2020, 2021, it's been frozen. And then as of this year, they've abolished it completely. So who it affects people that have a pension pot above the lifetime allowance. So let's just say, for simplicity, the lifetime allowance was £1 million. When you take money from your pension, that registers as a crystallisation event. Okay. And let's just say you crystallise £1 million in your pension, anything above that would be taxed. And the way it's taxed depends on how you take it. So if you took it via a lump sum, it would be taxed at 55%. If you took it via income, it would be taxed at 25%. And then at 75, the pension pot is tested again against the lifetime allowance. So let's just say that million then grew to 2 million. You'd already crystallised a million, and you got a million above the crystallised amount that you crystallised. Your pension pot is then going to be taxed at 25% on that amount. So it was it affected anyone that had a big pension pot, and it also disincentivized people to pay into pension schemes if they already had a lifetime allowance issue. But as of 2024, they've abolished the lifetime allowance completely.
Okay, fantastic. And what have been those changes in 2024?
So the changes, the part they've abolished is the test at 75. Okay, yeah. So that's completely gone. And the 25 and the 55% charges have completely gone as well. So if, for example, you've got a pension pot that's above the lifetime allowance, then you can keep contributing towards your pension and you're not going to get taxed when you take money out of that pension. There have been some things that haven't changed. So, for example, another benefit crystallisation event is if you transfer your pension pot to a QROPS, your whole pension pot is crystallised and then it's never tested against the lifetime allowance ever again. So one of the strategies people adopted over recent years, if their pension pot was above the lifetime allowance or it was slightly below, was to transfer to a QROPS, because then they knew they were never going to have a lifetime allowance issue again at 75 when their pension pot grew. So that has still remained, which means there's no benefit to transferring into a pension if you are above the lifetime allowance. But another thing that has remained is the lifetime allowance on the tax-free lump sum. So you get 25% tax-free if you're a UK resident, but it's only up to the lifetime allowance. So let's say the lifetime allowance is currently £1,070,100. So you get 25% up to that amount. So if your pension pot was 2 million, you're not going to get 500,000. You're going to get 25% of the lifetime allowance. So that has stayed into play. But one other thing that's been brought into play is tax on death. So anything above the lifetime allowance on death is actually going to be taxed, whereas before it wasn't. So it does still mean that there is careful planning involved. And for example, utilising different strategies is really important still, because they haven't abolished all of those elements and they have introduced other elements as well.
Okay, and with that tax, is that the death tax? Is that sort of a marginal rate? Is it, or is it a fixed rate? What does that look like?
Yeah, tax at your marginal rate. So again, a really, really heavy tax, whereas pension pots were used in the past to pass on to generations, because what you can do is you can transfer a pension. But in fact, there's two ways you can take the pension pot. One is via a lump sum. So if, for example, you're below the age of 75, a pension pot can be passed on to a beneficiary tax-free, as long as they're a UK resident. If they're outside of the UK, then tax often applies, but it depends on the jurisdiction of where you're living. Post 75, it was taxed at the marginal rate as well. But what people then did is make sure they had a pension scheme that allowed you to transfer to a dependent's pension. So this meant stayed in the pension, transferred to a pension for the dependent, i.e. the beneficiary, whoever you put down to pass the pension on to. And it wasn't a taxable event. So you could pass on whatever you wanted before. So if you had £5 million, it was a great inheritance tax strategy to reduce to pass assets on to your loved ones, and that could go from generation to generation. So if that was you, pass it on to your kids, and they didn't spend it all, and they pass it on to their grandkids, and so on. That applied. So that is one way they're trying to increase taxes, because the UK government love to tax on death. We have an extremely high inheritance tax rate compared to other countries where, we haven't seen the nil rate band go up for a considerable amount of time, and it still sits at £325,000 per individual. They did introduce a residential nil rate band, which meant, if you own a property, you've got £175,000 each as well. So combined £1 million, but above that, it's 40%. So people looked at utilising trust structures to avoid that. But this is just another way for the government to try and make money, and they tend to go after pension pots. And the lifetime allowance, it mainly because it's sticky money. You can't just take all of your money out. But bringing in changes like this, it often leads to people making irrational decisions. And for example, in the last year, somebody could have, for example, or they tried to transfer to a QROPS, and then they actually changed the rules to a QROPS to stop people transferring to QROPS, because probably they knew the changes that were going to come into play this year.
No, interesting. So what can be done then to protect from sort of the lifetime allowance? What can be done there to protect clients from that?
So there's always been an option to apply for protection. So for example, when the lifetime allowance was at 1.8 million and it dropped to 1.5, there was a period of time where you could then protect your pension pot up to 1.8 million. The same when it dropped to 1.25, you could protect it up to 1.5, and the same when it dropped to 1 million, you could apply up to 1.25 million. And the same still applies today. So you can go on the HMRC website, you can apply for fixed protection. It's called Fixed Protection 2016. So this you've been able to apply this to this for 8 years now.
Wow.
And it just means you have an increased tax-free lump sum element, and it also increases the amount of the death tax from the LTA as well. So if anyone has, and this doesn't mean that you have to have a pension pot above the lifetime allowance to apply for it. Let's just say you're 40 years old, you've got £800,000 in your pension, or even £600,000 in your pension, and you're investing aggressively, and you think at some point your pension pot's going to be above the lifetime allowance, definitely apply for it, because it costs absolutely nothing. And when the changes come into play, you've then missed out, because let's just say they drop the lifetime allowance for the tax-free lump sum, the death tax as well, let's just say to 800,000. Then the fixed protection they're probably going to introduce is the one currently, which is £1,070,100. So by being proactive and just applying for that today, it just gives you a bit of breathing space that if they do make changes in the future, it's actually not going to affect you.
And how would you know if you already have protection? Is that something that you've done in the past? And as you said, you go on the HMRC and you get that sorted. People now, what sort of protection? How would they find out the protection they have on their pension? Because it has gone up and down so many times, over the years, especially with the reform back in the day. But it's kind of where would you find that information?
So you'd have had to physically gone on there and get the protection yourself. So if they then send you a certificate, it's a very, very fast process. So it's literally click of a button, they send you the certificate, and it's done. So it's not a long-winded process like a lot of the UK Gov stuff is, such as topping up a UK state pension from abroad. You don't have to wait 2 years to get it done. So that is just a very fast, efficient thing to do that everyone needs to do if they think at some point it's going to be impacted. So I think anyone that has a pension pot where they think at some point is going to be above the lifetime allowance, or they even predict and have the assumption that the lifetime allowance could be reduced even further, then just apply for it, because the people that all of my clients have done this, and no one's going to not thank you for it, and they're definitely going to thank
Yeah.
you for it if it does drop in the future.
Well, it's definitely important, isn't it, having that protection there? And if it's free of cost, free of charge, why not just get it in place and have that, that peace of mind, essentially, isn't it? So what do you think, the future of the LTA is then? What's your sort of, crystal ball moment really, and seeing the future?
Yeah. So the the Conservatives were the ones that scrapped it. Labour then came out and said that if they come into power, they were going to reintroduce it. They've now done a U-turn and said they're not going to reintroduce it.
Yeah.
And they were potentially going to get rid of the 25% tax-free lump sum. But again, it seems like they've done a U-turn on that as well. So it's very hard to guess the future. But if you look at the trends, it's always been negative, apart from what the Conservatives did last year. Because going into that budget, they actually expected the lifetime allowance to decrease, and then it was abolished. Well, it was abolished on parts of it. So now the changes that are going to come into play are not going to have such a big impact, because it's just going to be an impact on death, and it's going to be an impact on the tax-free lump sum. But if you are, for example, a non-UK resident, then the impacts are minimal anyway, because, for example, the tax-free lump sum often is taxed, and the inheritance tax rules will depend on the country of where you're living.
Yeah.
So, and it also depends on where your beneficiary is going to be tax resident. So it's actually, if you've got, for example, 3 children, one of them live in the UK, you've got £1 million in the pension pot, and you've got 2 million in investment accounts. It requires careful planning to make sure you do the right thing, because the UK resident isn't going to be taxed by receiving that pension pot as a lump sum, whereas the overseas residents would be. I'm talking about if you died before the age of 75. So the future, it's very, very difficult to predict, because every single year there does seem to be a change. And if we were speaking 3-4 years ago and the pension pot was near the last one ounce, the go-to would have always been a cure-ops for overseas residents, because it just dealt with the issue there and then. It was never going to be an issue for them in the future. And those that did that, again, don't have the worry of the UK making changes, because they can't make changes to the cure-ops, because it's based in Malta or Gibraltar or other countries if they have a cure-ops as well. So yeah, just to finish that question off, the future is never simple, but having a financial advisor that understands the different changes that are coming into play, whether that's from the budget or from a new election, is really, really important, because it's a very, very confusing topic.
Yeah, definitely.
Last one ounce, even for me as a financial advisor, trying to explain this to clients, sometimes I have to explain it for years before they fully understand it, because there's no real simple way to actually explain it, because it's this part, it's that part.
And then all the laws change, and then you have to. It's constantly changing. The pension system in the UK is crazy. But what would you suggest the next steps? If I was an expat now living overseas, what would you suggest my next steps would be to sort of making sure I'm secure going forward and I've got a peace of mind?
Yeah, I think the best step is, if you have a pension pot that is near the last one ounce, is to speak to a financial advisor, especially one that has a network of cross-border tax advisors, because the most important part is understanding how it impacts you in your country of residence when you take money from the pension pot and when you pass away. Yep. Because it isn't a black and white answer. It depends on the country, because each country will have a double taxation agreement. If they don't have a double taxation agreement, it falls back to the UK. So places like Thailand, places like Brazil, for example, they're just 2 that I know off the top of my head that don't have a double taxation agreement. So you end up just paying tax in the UK. But it's understanding the cross-border element that's really, really important, because as an expat, things become a lot more complicated. It's not just looking at the UK rules, it's looking at the rules in the country where you're living as well. So speak to an advisor who has a network of tax advisors to make sure that when you make the decision, whether that is to withdraw from the pension or you're looking at estate planning, you know exactly how things work. And then by having a relationship ongoing, if there are changes, those changes can be discussed with you straight away.
Fantastic.